Emily sat on the steps of a house that no longer felt like home. The wind blew softly, carrying with it the voices of children playing somewhere far away. But no one called her name. No one waited for her inside. She was only 10, but her world already felt heavy. Her parents had argued for months, and then, one quiet morning, they left. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't even look back. Emily sat there, waiting for hours, then days. Her little heart didn't want to believe the truth. She was alone, truly alone. The wooden boards beneath her feet were cracked, and the smell of dust and emptiness filled the air. She whispered to herself, "Maybe they'll come back tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Days turned into weeks. Emily realized her family was not coming back. She had packed a small cloth bag with the little she had, a dress, a comb, and an old book her grandmother once gave her. With bare feet and tired eyes, she wandered through the streets. She watched other homes, glowing with warmth and laughter. Families sat at dinner tables, mothers serving food, children giggling, fathers returning from work. Emily stood still, watching those windows as if they were little worlds she could never enter. She pressed her face against her bag, wishing it could hug her back, but it couldn't. No hand reached out for hers. No voice called her name. The streets grew colder and the shadows longer. For the first time, she whispered, "Maybe I don't belong anywhere." Her voice trembled like the last leaf in autumn. One evening, when Emily thought no one could see her, a soft voice broke through her silence. "Child, are you hungry?" Emily lifted her eyes slowly. In front of her stood a woman with silver, hair tied neatly in a bun. Her face carried lines of age, but also kindness. The woman held a basket filled with warm bread, its scent drifting gently through the cool air. Emily wanted to nod, but her throat felt locked. She had forgotten what kindness sounded like. The woman, Margaret, crouched down so she could see Emily eye to eye. "It's all right," she said softly, offering a piece of bread. Emily hesitated, then reached out. The bread was warm, soft against her cold fingers. Tears blurred her sight. That one small piece of bread tasted like hope. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt someone had noticed her. Someone cared. Margaret did not walk away after handing Emily the bread. Instead, she stayed, watching the girl eat as if she hadn't tasted food in days. Emily's little shoulders trembled, not only from hunger but from fear. When Margaret quietly offered her hand, Emily froze. For a long moment, the world seemed still. The street lamps flickered on, the air grew colder, and her heart pounded in her chest. Then, gently, Emily placed her small hand in Margaret's. It felt rough but safe, like a branch that wouldn't break. Margaret smiled faintly and said, "Come with me, dear. You don't have to be alone tonight." Emily didn't know where they were going. She didn't know if she should trust this stranger. But deep inside, something told her this. Hand would not let go. Together, they walked, leaving behind the empty street that had once been her only companion. Margaret's home was nothing grand, but it felt alive. The walls carried the faint smell of cinnamon and wood smoke. A small fire burned in the fireplace, filling the room with gentle warmth. Emily sat quietly on a chair, her small bag clutched tightly in her lap. She didn't want to put it down, afraid she might lose the only things she still had. From the kitchen, Margaret stirred a pot of soup, the sound of the wooden spoon tapping against the sides. "It'll be ready soon," she said softly. Emily glanced around. The table was simple, set for two, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The fire crackled gently, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt her body relax. It was a strange feeling. Comfort. She didn't know how long it would last, but in that little room, the world didn't seem so cruel. The soup was hot and filled with soft vegetables and bits of bread. Emily lifted the spoon carefully, as though she didn't believe it was meant for her. Margaret sat across the table, watching with patient eyes. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush. She simply smiled as if telling Emily, "You are safe here." Each spoonful filled Emily not just with food, but with warmth that reached places hunger could not touch. Slowly, her shoulders eased. The sound of the fire, the clink of the spoon against the bowl, and Margaret's quiet presence made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. She dared to lift her eyes and meet Margaret's. For a brief moment, she saw no judgment, no anger, only kindness. And that kindness was enough to melt a little of the fear that had built inside her heart. That night, Margaret showed Emily to a small room at the back of the house. The bed was simple, covered with a quilt that looked carefully stitched by hand. Emily touched the fabric, tracing the patterns of flowers sewn into it. It felt too nice, too gentle, almost like it didn't belong to her. But Margaret said softly, "This is yours tonight. Sleep well, little one." Emily lay down slowly, her bag still near her side, as if she feared it might disappear. The quilt wrapped around her like arms she had longed for. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint sound of the fire crackling in the next room. For the first time since her family left, her breathing slowed. She drifted into sleep, safe and warm. From the doorway, Margaret stood watching, her face touched with a quiet smile. She didn't see a burden. She didn't see a stranger. She saw a child who needed love. Morning sunlight spilled through the window, painting golden patterns on the wooden floor. Emily stood quietly by the window, her hands pressed against the glass. Birds sang outside, and the world seemed softer than it had in a long time. Behind her, Margaret poured tea into 2 cups, the steam curling gently into the air. "Breakfast is ready," she said kindly. Emily turned, unsure if she was allowed to stay another day. The question burned inside her. Would she be sent away? Was this kindness only for one night? Margaret seemed to sense the worry. She placed the tea on the table and looked at Emily with steady eyes. "You don't have to leave," she said, softly. "You can stay here as long as you need." Emily's chest tightened. The words sounded almost impossible. For a child who had been abandoned, those few words felt like a miracle. In the days that followed, Emily began to find a rhythm in Margaret's home. Each morning, she would help in the bakery. At first, she was shy, her hands uncertain, but Margaret guided her gently, showing her how to knead dough, how to sprinkle flour just enough, how to fold the bread with care. Emily stood on a little stool to reach the counter, her face lighting up when she managed to shape a loaf that almost looked like Margaret's. Sometimes she had flour on her nose, sometimes on her cheeks, and Margaret would laugh softly. "You're learning fast," she would say. Emily felt something grow inside her, a seed of confidence. She had not only found food and warmth, but also purpose. People from the village began to notice her, too. "Who's this sweet little helper?" they asked. And each time Margaret answered with pride, "This is Emily." For the first time, Emily's name sounded like it belonged. Margaret knew that Emily's life needed more than bread and shelter. She needed learning, knowledge, and the chance to grow. So one morning, Margaret placed a small notebook and pencil in front of her. "Let's start with your name," she said gently. Emily hesitated. Her hands trembled, unused to holding a pencil. But with Margaret's hand guiding hers, she slowly wrote the first letter, E, then another, and another. Emily. The letters were crooked and shaky, but to her, they were more beautiful than anything she had ever seen. She stared at the page, her eyes shining with tears. "That's me," she whispered. Margaret nodded proudly. "Yes, dear, that's you." Each day after, Emily practiced more. Each word she learned was like a window opening to a world she never knew she could enter. And with every lesson, her heart grew stronger, her spirit brighter. One chilly afternoon, a small boy came to the bakery, his clothes torn, his face pale with hunger. Emily looked at him and felt a sharp ache in her chest. She saw herself in his tired eyes. Without waiting, she picked up a loaf of bread and handed it to him. The boy's hands shook as he took it, his lips whispering, "Thank you." Emily smiled softly. She knew exactly what hunger felt like, what loneliness did to the heart. Margaret watched from behind the counter, her eyes filling with quiet tears. The little girl she had found lost and broken on the street was now sharing warmth with others. Kindness given, Margaret thought, has a way of multiplying. Emily had once received bread that tasted like hope. Now she was the one giving it. And in that moment she realized something important. She was no longer alone. She was part of something greater. Time, like the steady ticking of a clock, carried Emily forward. The frightened little girl slowly blossomed into a bright young woman. She grew taller, her hair brushed neatly each morning by her own hands, her eyes filled with life instead of fear. She read books by the fireplace, her lips moving softly as she sounded out words she once couldn't recognize. She laughed more often, her voice carrying through the bakery as she greeted customers. Festivals in the village became moments of joy, with Emily standing proudly beside Margaret, her heart swelling as she realized she had found family, even if not by blood. The town no longer saw her as the abandoned girl. They saw her as Margaret's daughter, as a helper, a learner, a giver. And deep inside, Emily carried a quiet promise. She would never let anyone feel the emptiness she once knew. The years touched Margaret gently, but time left its marks. Her hair grew whiter, her steps slower, her voice softer, yet her eyes still carried the same kindness that had saved Emily. One evening, Margaret sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in a shawl, her hands resting on her lap. Emily knelt beside her, holding those hands tenderly. "You gave me everything," Emily whispered. Margaret smiled faintly, brushing Emily's hair back with shaky fingers. "No, child, you gave me everything. You gave me purpose when my days felt empty. You gave me laughter when I thought I had none left." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her heart aching with both love and fear of losing the woman who had become her whole world. She pressed Margaret's hand to her cheek, silently promising to carry her kindness forward. In that quiet room, there was no need for more words. Love spoke loudly enough. When the time came, Emily stepped into Margaret's shoes, not to replace her, but to honor her. The bakery became her heart's work. Each morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the village, welcoming all. Children ran inside, their laughter filling the space where silence once lived. The villagers smiled not just because of the bread, but because of the warmth that came with it. Above the door hung a new sign, painted by Emily herself. Margaret's Bread and Hope. Every loaf carried a story. Every slice carried love. Emily never forgot the night she first tasted hope in the form of bread. And now, she gave that same hope to others. The bakery was no longer just a place of work. It was a home, a beacon, a promise that kindness could change everything. Margaret's legacy lived on, not in grand buildings or riches, but in the heart of the girl she once saved. One quiet morning, Emily walked to the garden where Margaret now rested. The grave was surrounded by blooming flowers, planted lovingly by Emily's own hands. She carried a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. Kneeling down, she placed it gently before the stone. "This is for you, Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. A tear slipped down her cheek, but her lips curved into a smile. She remembered the first time Margaret had offered her bread, the moment that changed everything. Emily stood, lifting her eyes toward the sky where sunlight broke through soft clouds. She felt Margaret's love still, woven into every corner of her life. Though Margaret was gone, Emily was not alone. She carried her mother's kindness in every loaf she baked, in every smile she gave, in every heart she touched. And so the girl once abandoned had become the woman who gave hope. Her story was no longer of loss, but of love.